Hey Patrick, great take on Einstein's diaries. It brought up another question for me, which was, when should we consider racism a moral failure? Judging by you bringing in moral relativism, that is not always. So if someone were or held racist views in a previous time where that was generally the accepted view, we shouldn't judge them on today's views, but the views at the time. And if we apply that to differences in time, why not apply that to differences in place? So in modern times, we could have people that grow up in a place where that's the common view, or even just a culture within a generally liberal society where racism still stands. It seems that there are quite a few of those. So should we not consider that a moral failing of theirs? And what are the limits of moral relativism? Curious to hear your take.
Fuck.
Patrick brings a certain something to the conversation around philosophy that I particularly find fascinating.
Can you dig it?
Oh my god, Patrick, you crack me up.
Can you dig it?
You go from talking about religion and Yahweh to a song about the cult of Moloch. That's fucking classic. Love it.
Can you dig it?
Hello humans, welcome to The Great Everything, the world's only podcast dedicated to art, donuts and transformation. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to devote my existence to culture and philosophy, the greatest self-improvement tools of all.
Great show today, man. Great show.
You're always so busy creating all of this amazingness.
Jeez, your show is just so stupid good.
Hey guys, it's Patrick, interrupting the show for a little bit of housekeeping. Now, as you've probably all noticed, sound quality has never been a top priority for The Great Everything. I've always done my best to keep things listenable, but at the end of the day, this is a venture that I started about a year ago, recording episodes on my phone using Anchor. So I always figured that if the content was interesting enough, it wouldn't really matter that it didn't sound ultra-professional. But of course, in recent times, there's been a dip in sound quality. Because when my mother fell ill, I had to leave my home and my country to move to Italy, to her home, to take care of her. And one of the great tragedies of this situation, apart from my mother having terminal brain cancer, is the fact that her walls in her home are wafer thin. Which means, and you've probably noticed this, that the sound of traffic is very hard to avoid when I'm recording an episode. Very often I'll stop just to wait for a siren or a motorbike sound or just other traffic noises to die down so I can continue talking about what I'm talking about. But this particular episode is, it's worse than that. Last Monday, my mother fell particularly ill, and I took her to the hospital. And for the past week, she and I have been living in a hospital room with all the hospital sounds that entails. Which means not only it's taken me a while longer to get this, as we sort of put out the fires of her latest medical emergency, but that I had to record this episode in the quietest place I could find, which is literally the toilet of my mother's hospital room. And yes, you won't hear flushing or anything, but you can certainly hear an echo that is particularly reminiscent of a bathroom, because that's what it is. I hope you forgive this dip in sound quality and that it doesn't impair your enjoyment of what I think was a rather interesting philosophical musing. So, with all that, thank you for listening. Okay, so today we're talking about morality again, that insoluble philosophical quagmire that tends to begin with legitimate questions about how should we live, what is the nature of right and wrong, and that usually ends with just a bad headache, zero answers, and everyone just agrees that it's probably all the immigrants' fault anyway. But it's still important to talk about morality, no matter how difficult it is to solve moral issues. Because ethics are literally what becoming a better person is all about. And it's not even just thinking about how to be a good human, it's about getting to the bottom of what that even means. And I think understanding that question and doing our best to live up to whatever answers we found, that is the truest and the deepest meaning of life. So our listener John asks a question, and the question is, when is racism a moral failure? And he's referring to a past episode on the recent controversy surrounding, quote, racist remarks by Albert Einstein that were found in his private diaries. Just to be clear, I don't think that John's question is implying that there are times when it's okay to be a racist. Rather, what John is saying is that if you take a behavior that we agree is racist, according to what we understand racism to be, the question is, when can we consider that behavior or speech as being indicative of bad character, as being immoral? You might say always. Racism, prejudice, or discrimination against a person or a group based on racial lines is always bad and always makes you a bad person. Now, if you believe that, you're probably what's known as a moral realist. That means that you believe there are such a thing as moral facts, things that are always right and wrong, and these answers are right and wrong no matter how you look at them, no matter what angle you come at them from, because maybe you believe there's a God, a universal being that makes these moral facts and that creates moral rules and gives those rules to us. Or maybe you don't believe in a God, maybe you're an atheist, but you believe that there are such a thing as moral facts that are baked in, hardwired into the fabric of the universe, just the same as other facts in physics or in chemistry and biology. Or maybe you don't believe there's such a thing as moral facts. You don't think that morality is made up of facts, but that it's made up of values. You have your values, I have mine. And they kind of work like preferences. Like, you like cheesecake, I like lemon meringue pie. I care about women's free choice, you care about unborn children getting killed. These aren't facts, they're values, they're like preferences. And if that's what you believe, there's a chance that you're a moral relativist, just like me. Now, there's a lot of different things people mean when they talk about moral relativism, but I'm talking about a type of moral relativism that is known as meta-ethical. Broadly speaking, to try and simplify it, it is the belief that there are no objectively right or wrong answers. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as right or wrong, but that these things are not universal facts. They are not objective truth. Whether something is right or wrong depends on the frame of reference. It's right or wrong from somewhere. But there's a big problem with moral relativism. Because if you're a realist, life is pretty easy. There's these universal truths about morality that we either know or that we can discover eventually. And all we have to do is just follow those rules. And we can be secure that if we follow those rules, we are doing what is objectively right. For a relativist, things are much trickier because we have a problem. If nothing is objectively right or wrong, on what grounds do we evaluate good and bad? The ancient Carthaginians used to perform ritual child sacrifice. They would literally grab small children, put them into the hands of a giant statue of one of their gods, and the baby would roll out of the hands into a furnace. They would burn children alive. And this was seen as a moral act. It would appease the gods. I could tell them killing is evil, and they would tell me, well, why do you say that? Actually, killing these babies is good because our God demands it. And what is more good than appeasing a God? And then if you're a moral relativist, you can't really say something like killing is just bad because you don't believe in moral facts that are universal. So without these moral facts, how do we decide what is good and what is bad? Some would say we don't. Good or bad, right and wrong is just a matter of what your culture tells you. And we have no right to tell other cultures, like the Carthaginians, what is good or bad. But others, including myself, would say that just doesn't feel right. Yeah, okay, morality may be relative, but that can't just mean that nothing is good or bad. Moral relativism isn't supposed to just be an ocean of nihilism. All it means is that we have to try a lot harder to find valid grounds to justify our moral values. But what could those grounds be? And this is where it gets really difficult, because whatever those grounds, that foundation is, it has to pretty much do the work of an axiom, a basic fundamental premise, a foundational truth that is self-evident, unimpeachable, beyond all doubt, so that it's fixed, it's anchored, it won't move around once you start building up from there. Kind of like the axioms of Euclid. There's only one straight line that can pass through two separate points. That, and a couple of other axioms, they're the firm foundations on which our geometry is built. You start with an axiom and you build up. Now you change one of those axioms and the whole thing just topples down. And here's another axiom. You are going to die. Spoiler alert. You know that. I know that. Everyone knows that. There's not a shred of doubt in you that this is true, that we are all going to die. And in many ways, this really does work like an axiom for how you live your whole life, right? How we all live. The fact that we're so impatient, that we need to get those grades, we need to get a job, we need to make money, we need to have a career, we need to find a partner, have kids, we need to live a good life as soon as possible because our time is limited. There's a sell-by date, and we don't want to get close to that sell-by date and feel like, fuck, this has just been a colossal waste of time. The fact that we are aware of our mortality is a basic premise that really influences pretty much everything about how we live. Now remove that axiom, say that we are born immortal and we know that, and we can make a case that everything about how we live and the things we value and the time we spend on those things, all that changes. But see, these two axioms, and I mean the geometrical one with the line going through the 2 points, and also the one about death, they're both facts. But what about making an axiom out of values? Can a value ever be as firm a grounding, as self-evident as a fact? So let's try it. Let's try by taking a value that hopefully we all agree on. We shouldn't cause people to suffer. Well, why not? Well, because suffering's bad. Why is suffering bad? Because we don't like it. Yeah, but not liking something doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Who made up that rule? I don't like medicine either. Is medicine bad? Well, medicine has a purpose. Suffering doesn't have a purpose. Actually, some suffering is clearly beneficial. Take childbirth or putting yourself through some intense training regime or a diet, stuff that is a nightmare to go through, but that yields long-term results and is often very healthy. That's beneficial suffering. Okay. But surely there is some suffering that serves no positive purpose, like violent crime. Violent crime is bad. Says who? You see, we're just going to go back and forth like this, ad infinitum. And at some point, I'm going to realize that I can't quite explain it. I just know it. I feel it, but I can't actually explain why pointless suffering is morally wrong. I don't like it, and so I call that bad. But that's a decision. It's not finding a fact in the universe that suffering is wrong. It's just us all agreeing on this value, in this case, the moral wrongness of pointless suffering, and drawing a line in the sand right there. But that's just our line. Because we know that there's masochists out there who love the feeling of pointless suffering. They chase it. And imagine this, if there were enough of them, enough masochists, to challenge where we chose to draw the line in the sand and say, actually, no, we want a different line in the sand right here. Because that feeling of pointless suffering, we love that. It gives our life meaning, and we call that good. Well then, the moral debate is basically just a power struggle between groups with completely different sets of values. It's a battle about who gets to define things as good or bad. And that's the problem. There's no fixed axioms in morality, no self-evident truths. And without those axioms, we're building a house on shaky ground because the foundations can always be questioned, and they always will be questioned because there'll always be someone who disagrees. So what we can do is we can pick our axiom, we can draw our line in the sand, like suffering is bad, or whatever God wills is good. But just like we can draw a line in the sand, so can others. And eventually, we're going to have to confront houses that look very different from our own. So after that fairly rambling and long preamble, let's get back to John's question. So I'd say racism is a moral failing in all societies today, East and West, wherever. Because there's so much talk, so much education, so much awareness about racism and hate, and so much agreement about them being bad things, that if, despite all this, you still mistreat someone based on their ethnicity, it means you are likely doing something that you know is considered wrong. Or, at the very least, you are lazily finding justifications for why you're right to hate this or that group, maybe because you've been wronged from someone belonging to that group. And instead of doing the work, the hard work on yourself, or fixing your own prejudice, you're just finding reasons to be hateful. That's a moral failing. Wherever you live, even if you live in Mongolia, you got the internet, you've seen the world, you know there's a better way to be. And racism, as in mistreating someone based on their race, was also a moral failing in the 1800s and the 1700s and so on, because the values that white Europeans said they believed in, and I'm talking specifically about the teachings of Jesus Christ, the logical conclusion of Jesus' teachings is anti-racist. I mean, Christ is so obviously against mistreating anyone, against hating anyone. It is so clear what Jesus stands for that the work you have to do to get from Jesus' teachings to anti-racism is very minimal. It's not even a step. You don't have to do much intellectual work to get there. So if you say you're a Christian, as almost everyone did back then, and despite that you still harm someone because of their skin color, best case scenario, you are being intellectual lazy to the point of immorality. Now let's go back a step. Let's go to ancient times. I think then, maybe, racism is less of a moral failing. Because back then there wasn't this universalizing ideology like Christianity saying love everyone. The belief systems back then were usually based on being part of a certain city, like being a citizen of Sparta or Thebes or Athens or Rome. And outsiders were, well, they were just not part of the group of people we should be morally concerned with. The Greeks called foreigners barbarians, literally stutterers, because they spoke so unintelligibly to Greeks that it sounded like they were just going ba, 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 hence barbaros. And of course, let's not forget that in ancient times, very often, outsiders were a real military threat. And, sure, you can look at ancient times and see that there were philosophers like Socrates and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius who had great moral intuitions that transcended their cultural norms. But these were truly exceptional, enlightened individuals. And in some cases, they were centuries ahead of their times. It's not reasonable, I think, to expect your average Theban or Roman to be as smart as Socrates. So, is there a general principle we can extract from all this? I think there is. And listen closely, because I think this is possibly an important rule. An act is a moral failing when it's reasonable to expect the person to know better. I'm going to repeat that. An act or behavior is a moral failing when it's reasonable to expect the person to know better. Now, that's just how I feel about the question. But that's not enough that I feel about it a certain way. Now I need to justify it in a way that is as convincing as possible. When we're saying that something is a moral failing, what we're doing is expressing a moral judgment. But what does it mean to morally judge someone? What's really going on in there? Morally judging someone means to evaluate a moral act against an appropriate standard of morality. To evaluate a moral act against an appropriate standard of morality. So let's break that down. What counts as a moral act? I believe a moral act implies a conscious choice between right and wrong. And that means that there's actually two elements here. First is the issue of choice, and the second is that it's a choice about morality, the right and wrong element. So let's start with choice. And look, before we move on, everything I say here assumes that we have free will. As you know, not just from listening to The Great Everything, but just, this is something people talk about. There's a real debate in ethics about free will versus determinism, and if all actions are determined, if everything is just a product of a massive domino effect that was set in motion billions of years ago, then does it even make sense to morally praise or morally condemn anyone? If what they're going to do is predetermined, can we really blame them or praise them? That's a whole can of worms that I'm sure we'll discuss here some other time. But for now, let's just assume that we all have free will to make our own moral choices. I remember this conversation I had in my first year of college with a guy called Edward. He was a Lutheran, an evangelical or a Lutheran, some kind of Protestant, and he was very, very devout, very religious. He truly believed that anyone who wasn't a member of his faith was a sinner. Anyone who didn't accept Jesus as their savior would go to hell. So I asked him about this, and I made a lot of examples. I was saying, well, what about the millions of good and kind and compassionate people who were born before Jesus? And what about all the people born after Christ, but in remote places, who had never really heard of Jesus? What about Aboriginals in Australia or Native Americans in 1400, people who were around before the Christian missionaries got there? Were they all going to hell? Yes, said Edward, all burning for eternity in the hell pits. I found this preposterous. I asked him, so you believe that God is going to punish people who never even had the chance to be good Christians? How is that fair? I mean, it felt like even if we assume that being Christian is good, their not being Christian couldn't be a moral failing because they never had the opportunity to be Christian. They never had a choice. So since that conversation, it's been very clear in my mind that whether you're good or bad has to involve some element of choice. Morality involves a choice. But what constitutes a choice? A choice has to be something that is not inevitable. It's only a choice if there are genuinely viable alternatives. So, for instance, a choice can't be coerced either. I used to be a lawyer, and in contract law, there's a rule that you can't agree to a contract if you're under duress. If someone forces you, if someone puts a gun to your head and forces you to sign a contract, that's not a valid agreement because you didn't enter it of your own free will. You had no choice. And I think morality should work similarly. If you murder someone, that's very immoral. But you murder someone because someone kidnapped your child and are threatening to kill her unless you commit a murder. In that case, maybe your murder is a little less immoral, right? Because your freedom to choose not to kill someone has been in some way affected. You haven't been deprived of the choice. You could still refuse to kill that person and que sera sera, but at the same time, your choice has been kind of forced in the sense that what kind of a person would allow their child to be killed by kidnappers? So is it as much of an immoral choice in that case if you murder someone? I think about my mother. Ever since her brain tumor, she's become increasingly aggressive. She doesn't talk much, but when I hold her hand, she'll drive her nail into my flesh, and she'll do it in a way that is meant to be painful. I see it in her expression. She sort of grits her teeth, and she looks at me with an expression of such anger and hate in her eyes. It's real hate. It's quite something. But at first, I was really hurt by this because I'm thinking, this is my mother. This is my number one ally in life. This is the person who's always had my back. And now she actively wants to harm me. Except, of course, I realize she can't control that. Her brain has been physically changed on a very fundamental level, and she can't do anything about it. It's not her choice. It's not immoral of her to do that, to hurt her son. Similarly, when a mentally ill person commits a crime, or, just does something inappropriate, like, they get naked in a cafe and piss on themselves, we don't reserve the same level of moral condemnation we would, if they were a sane person doing this. In fact, usually what we feel is compassion. And that is because we feel that their choice to do or not do the thing is somehow impaired, is somehow limited. Let's take it down a notch. What about a kid from a really, really, really bad neighborhood and with a terrible background, no family, no support, no nothing? And this kid, he goes on and he hustles, he sells weed, whatever, he does immoral things. Is his choice to commit crimes as immoral as my choice to commit crimes would be with my privileged background? Of course, he has a choice, same as I have a choice, because it's not that every disadvantaged person has to become a criminal. But the question is, how available, how feasible, and how difficult were the alternative options? And if we feel that those options were really hard to reach, then maybe we have to soften our moral condemnation of people from difficult backgrounds who resort to certain immoral actions. So to cap it up, for something to qualify as a moral act, capable therefore of withstanding moral judgment, there needs to be a legit choice being made there between viable alternatives. But the question is, what kind of choice? So a moral act is a choice where there is, or there should be, some consideration of morality in the person making a choice. I'll put it this way, and this is an example that I love because it's the kind of small thing that happens to me every day, and every time I think about it and I wrestle with it and I end up doing something I hate doing, which is touching some dirty thing. I'm very hygienic and I don't like touching used tissues by other people and stuff like that. So this is the example. It's a gross one to me at least. So say I'm walking down a corridor or a clean street and there's a dirty tissue on the ground or a newspaper, and I see it and I ignore it and I move on. I don't think I'm committing a moral action, either good or bad, because the choice doesn't register. But if when I see the dirty tissue, there's even just one moment where I stop and I think, I should pick that up, or someone better take care of that, well then, I've configured it as a choice in my mind. So now, if I move on, I've chosen to move on, while feeling that something better should have been done there. I've committed a moral act. I had two options available. They were moral options to pick it up or move on, and I chose to move on. But notice something. What made it a moral choice in the first place is the fact that I started thinking in terms of right and wrong. My own moral standards tell me that litter on the street is wrong. So interestingly, it's those same moral standards that make my act a moral act. If I came from a culture that didn't give a shit about littering on the street, in my mind there never would have been a question. There never would have been a issue of right or wrong. So my choice to not pick it up wouldn't be a choice. It would have just been an automatic thing that I did. So in not picking this issue up, I wouldn't be committing any moral act. And this highlights a very important point. Could it be that what makes something a moral act or not is the moral standard you aspire to?
Can you dig it?
I ain't embarrassed to use the word.
Can you dig it?
I'm talking about ethics.
Can you dig it?
Damn it, Patrick!
You silver-tongued devil here.
If moral judgment is an evaluation of a moral act or a choice against an appropriate moral standard, the last remaining question is, what standard counts as appropriate? Now, I think we agree we can't judge people against some single universal standard of absolute morality, because we don't know if such a thing exists, and even if we did know it existed, we wouldn't know what it is. And similarly, any current set of moral rules only works as a good standard for the people of that time. And this is a point that I made in the Einstein episode. If we say that the ancient Romans should be judged against our moral standards, then we're also saying that we should be judged against the standards of thousands of years in the future. And why not millions of years in the future? Why not the standards of an alien species far more evolved than us? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we can't know those standards. And if we don't know the standards, we don't really have an option of choosing or ignoring that set of moral rules. So failure to live up to future morality isn't a failure of morality, it's a failure of knowledge. So one thing that we've kind of found out through this ramble is that whatever the appropriate moral standard is, it has to be a standard that the person knows. You can't act in accordance with a morality you've never encountered. Which also means we cannot judge people against our own personal morality. And I don't mean the system of morality we ascribe to. I mean our own very personal, intimate set of rules. Because we can't expect people to know or understand all of our own personal rules. But also, we can't judge people against the cultural norms of society, because what is the morality of a society? In a liberal democracy such as ours, people have all sorts of moral beliefs. Some people are Christians, some are Muslims, some are Sikhs, some are atheists, some are utilitarians, some are deontologists, and everything in between. So which of those moral guidelines are the correct standard? But our thinking about the paper tissue has revealed something that, well, I'd never considered before. It's a bit weird, it's a bit controversial, but maybe the appropriate moral standard that you should be measured against is your own, which may or may not be shared and supported by large sections of society, but ultimately the point is that it is your morality. So let's explore that. Have you ever swatted a mosquito? Sure you have. Was it immoral? Probably not. You probably never considered it as a moral choice to swat the mosquito or to let it live. But of course, there's Jainism, the Eastern religion, which is so much against killing that fundamentalist Jains sweep the ground in front of them before they walk in order to avoid accidentally stepping on bugs and killing them. They even wear little nets on their mouth so they don't accidentally swallow a bug while they breathe. Someone who strongly believes that killing a bug is so immoral that they obsessively try to avoid even doing it by accident. Well, if that someone does kill a bug by accident, that could be immoral because maybe they didn't sweep the floor, maybe they didn't wear their little net. They didn't do something that they believed was crucial to avoid killing another living being. According to their own moral standard, they should have known better. Now, I think this really works. Let's take it closer to home. Let's say you're pro-choice. If you're pro-choice, an abortion is not immoral, period. But if you're sincerely pro-life and you have an abortion because maybe you can't afford to have a child or because you don't want to deal with the consequences, well, then your choice might be immoral. Because according to your beliefs, you are now killing a living soul. And maybe the reason you are doing it is to make your life easier. You are failing to live up to your own moral standards. Whether or not you are being moral or immoral depends on the standards you pick and whether you live up to them. But what happens with more extreme cases? I think this is very interesting. Let's say someone believes that killing prostitutes is good because maybe he believes he's saving their souls from sin. He doesn't hate the prostitutes, he doesn't judge them, maybe he even has compassion for these prostitutes, and he doesn't like killing, but he believes that he is genuinely doing them a profoundly good service. And also, let's say that he's not mentally ill, and this is actually what he believes as a rational human being. Are we now forced to say that he is good because he's living up to his sincere moral beliefs? I think this is a fascinating question. Let's say the whole world believes that same thing, that killing prostitutes is somehow a good thing. And let's also say that the whole world doesn't believe that killing is bad, so there's no contradiction between killing and being a good person. Then in that case, maybe I would say, yeah, this guy is a good guy. Because would it be reasonable for him to be the only person in the world to see beyond that culture, to see beyond that set of rules and come up with something different? I don't think that he could know better. If, though, he's just alone in doing this, or maybe he's a part of a small group that believe this, like, the Westboro Baptist Church of killing prostitutes, well then, I think it's a false question. Because in our real world, where most of us believe that killing is bad, if not everyone, and in a world where most people don't believe that killing prostitutes is a morally good thing to do, our hooker killer, he's had ample opportunities to test his moral belief against viable alternatives. He will have had to question them. There must have come a point where the contradiction between being a good person and killing harmless women would have had to come to his attention. In other words, in the real world, such an extreme case falls apart because there's no way a sane person could live in this world and genuinely believe that killing prostitutes could ever be a morally good thing to do, or to be able to rationally justify that belief. In the real world, he should know better. I feel we're getting somewhere. Because now we have this. We have a principle that to judge someone morally, they have to have a legitimate free choice between viable moral options. And the standard we judge them against has to be their own standard and how well they lived up to it. And I don't think that extreme examples, like the hooker killer, debunk this rule, because either they don't genuinely believe what they say is good, like they don't genuinely believe that killing hookers is good, they just tell themselves that so maybe they can indulge some evil instinct. Deep down they know what they're doing is wrong. Or they're insane, in which case it's not an issue of morality but of mental health. Maybe that's how we judge people in societies, according to the sets of moral values that are reasonably available to them. And I think that's a good rule. An act is a moral failing when it's reasonable to expect the person to know better. And if that person has had the opportunity to see other ways of being, ways that minimize senseless human suffering, it's reasonable for them to know better. And frankly, today, most people have that option. We live in a global world. Everyone has an internet connection. Everyone has that education and information available to them. Everyone has the chance to confront different ideas and to debate them and to question their own beliefs against different sets of values. No matter what their culture tells them, they should know better. Before I close this, I'd like to end with a little consideration. I've talked about a definition of what it means to morally judge a person or a society. But there's an interesting question as to what's going on psychologically when we express a moral judgment. And I had this thought, that what we're really doing when we're expressing such a moral judgment is we're trying to establish where we stand on the moral hierarchy compared to the person or the people we're judging. So what we're secretly getting at with these evaluations is that we're better than the Romans because they had slavery. We're better than the alt-right because they're racist. We're better than the incels because they're misogynist. We're worse than the vegans because, well, we've read the stories about factory farming, but damn, cheese is so tasty. So what we're really doing is playing some weird status game. But what's the point of that? Sure, if I'm a fundamentalist Christian and you're a fundamentalist Christian, it makes sense to compare how you and I behave and to find out who is more pious, who best lives up to those standards that we both aspire to. But how can you ever compare the moral standing of people belonging to different belief systems? Who's a better communist, Lenin or George Bush? The answer isn't Lenin. The answer is Bush isn't a communist. Where do you get off competing with someone who isn't competing with you? Does a professional athlete say he's a better basketball player than a toddler? Do you read better than a chicken? To morally compare ourselves to people from different value systems is as senseless an exercise as it would be to ask the question, which tastes better, Beethoven's symphonies or the Empire State Building?
I feel like the carpet's been yanked out from under me. I don't know which end is up. I'm not even sure how to react. I'm too confused. If you imagine yourself a visitor, somebody still with the capacity for wonder, someone with a fresh perspective. That's what it is, Larry.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Great Everything. And if you like the show, there's a few ways you can help out. You can leave a review on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to this podcast. Or you can share it, embed it, talk about it on your podcast or write a blog about it. Or you could just add me on the various Twitters and Instagrams out there. Until then, grazie e arrivederci.
Well, arrivederci, Luigi.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.